Sí. Just join us.
Hi all.
Let's see, there is still more few people coming in the room. We can wait until like 5.
Good morning, everyone.
Hello, Chokri. Thank you very much. So welcome everybody to join us today. So we are glad that you can join us for this morning sessions. So today we will talk about the Fair Impact. The today's session is about is being part of the Fair Implementation Framework workshop series offered by Fair Impact Project. So today we'll tackle the open access publishing in the Fair Action Plans. So just before to go into the session, so I would just say a few words about that. The session will be recorded, and so it's also will be available for the general public via the YouTube. So if you don't want to be on camera and you don't want to have your voice recorded, so please feel free to use the chat. And so before to going into the session, I will start to introduce myself. So my name is Nina Gros, and I will be the facilitator of today's session. I'm working as a project manager in RAE, which is a French National Research Institute in Agriculture, Food and Environment. I'm involved in the Fair Impact project, mainly in the Work Package 2 and Work Package 4, which are respectively associated to the support program and the metadata aspect of the project. So today I will be standing in the for Suzanne Dumauchel and Salomé Landel from the French National Institute CNRS, who have made a lot of effort to prepare this workshop and organize this session, but they cannot be present today. So before going into the session, I will give you a little flavor of what's about the project is all about and what's going to happen today. We'll be together for a 2-hour session, starting with a brief introduction of the National Level Initiative Support Program that's being offered by the Fair Impact Project. Then I will be joined by Margot Barguier, who coordinates the CRAFT OA European project, and she will give us an overview of what's about the Diamond Open Access journal platform. I will tell you more about Margot's expertise later on the presentation, and after her presentation, we will have like plenty of time for question and discussion. So as I mentioned, the session is recorded and will be available on YouTube. So please switch off your microphone during the presentation. And regarding the Q&A questions, please write them on the chat and I will be sure that they will be asked. So what's about the Fair Impact project? It's a European Commission Horizon Europe 4 years project, and we are primarily here to help to realize the vision of European open science cloud. So our aim is particularly to enabling fair related aspects. So meaning that we ensure that data are findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, and we are really trying to support the uptake of the tools, approaches, methods that are going through the pipeline and we are really about trying to support the take-up of these practices. So we start in June 2022, and so we just passed our first year and a half activity, and we have another year and a half to go, so until that 2025. So we are quite a large project of coordination and support action. We are 10 million euro project, and we are quite a large consortium with 28 partners from different member states and a lot of different stakeholders. We are quite a mixed group, and we are hoping that the broad range of people with a lot of different expertise that will be used to share with the community as we deliver the support. So a little bit about what Fair Impact Project is trying to achieve. As I mentioned, we are really trying to support the implementation and the uptake of fair and enabling practices across different levels, European, national, and local. So how we are doing that? So part of the work have been over the first years of the project to look back and see what's really out there. So we really don't want to reinvent any wheels, and we just to make sure that we can really take the use of the tools that have been done through previous projects, and particularly outputs from projects that are funded in the program just before Horizon Europe, or our project, but our programs, so like the Horizon 2020, that were funded to support the realization of the EOSC, the European Open Science Cloud. And found thing that we can promote and through the support projects. Another aspect is to translating solution from one domain to another. So we have specific partners coming from the life science, social science, agriculture science, photo and natural communities. So we are trying to define things that have been developed and tested within one community and can maybe translate and help other community to take out. We are also looking and trying and progress to the definition of support and governance and coordination mechanism, like governance of semantic artifact and metadata and metrics. So we have a lot of activities to support the of support, and it's really the heart of the Fair Impact project and what it's trying to do. So for the Fair National Initiative Support Program, it's composed of a series of workshops where we are giving dedicated guidance and one-to-one support to a cohort of successful applicants. So we will work with them to develop action plans and engagement plans and they will get like one-on-one support from mentors. So the aim of this support offer is to provide examples and good practices to self-assess their current capabilities and define how to develop a fair implementation action plan at their country level. So today we have like a mixed audience composed of the successful applicants and also the public hearings. So everyone is of course invited to ask questions and to put them in the chat. So the Fair Action Plan framework is composed of multiple steps, not only focused on tools that you need to implement fair and practical sense, but although there is a lot of things that you have to think about. So you have first to define your objective, why and how do you want to become fair enabling, the actions, meaning that what kind of concrete actions you have to take to move on, and milestones, where are the current capabilities and where you want to go and when, the role and responsibilities and engagement and who you want to get involved, and also the priority of your plan. So here you can have like an overview of the scheduled workshop series for the national initiative level support program. So today is the third workshop. We already had two before last week, which are already available on the Fair Impact website. So the first one was about the national plan in Germany and Romania, and the second one was about how to engage researchers with the fairness. And today it's about the open access publishing in the Fair Action Plan. So there is still a couple of other workshops planned until June. Two last sessions are focused on the peer exchange session. And all along the workshop series, the applicant are supported by the mentor to draft all the material steps for their implementation action plan. Then I will hand over to Margot Bargier, and our keynote speaker today. She will run through Diamond Open Access Journal platform. So first, I will say a few words about Margot Bargier. She's a trained graphic designer and older master's degree in social anthropology and media studies. She is head of the team of electronic publishing in Göttingen University Library in Germany, including Göttingen University Press, the university's repository, and the Diamond Open Access Journal platform, and other services around scholarly communication. She's and her team coordinate the Craft OA project, and other team members also involved in DIMAS and Polarma projects and in the German information platform on Open Access Network. So Margot heads the Association of European University Press Board, and she's part of the German working group's Sounding Board for the University Press. So the aim of the session today is to discuss about open access publication models, the financial, legal, and technical aspects, how to make them available from different type of reader, and how to increase their visibility and reuse the academic field. So thank you, Margot, for being here with us today, and we are really pleased to listen to you. So the floor is yours. And I will stop to share my screen so you can, yeah.
So thank you for the invitation and welcome everybody. This will be probably a bit different than what you expect. So I won't bother you with lots of details and showing you all these open access things. But what I will do today is drill a bit deeper into it, because when we started the Craft OA project, and I will introduce the project, it was for many of us in our consortium quite a challenge to understand why we have been funded under the EOSC infrastructure framework. And because we had been struggling with it, we thought that maybe other people also try to make sense why open access publishing is part of the EOSC. I listened to a talk from one of the most important stakeholders around the EOSC in Germany, that is Klaus Tochtermann. And he pictures the EOSC still with a strong focus on research data. And yes, you can imagine that open access publications are also research data. And why that is true, I hope to show you in the next minutes. And what I would like now is that you briefly take a second to think, do you really know about open access and all its flavors, or would you want me to briefly explain it, to just recall it again so that we're all on the same page? Because I come from publishing, and Nina has explained this, so I have a long-standing background in publishing, and for me, I take it for granted that everybody knows about open access because I've been doing this for 20 years. But I think for many people, this is something like most people have heard about it and they are sort of familiar with it, but they're not totally deep into it. So if you think you want a brief catch up on open access and its flavors, then raise your thumbs and I can see it and then I will do it. Otherwise, your chance is over and you have to keep your questions for the questions.
I think it would be really great if you can start with a short introduction about open access.
Okay, open access, we usually understand the way the term is coined. It's open access, and mostly it's understood open access, free access on the internet to scientific literature, scientific publications. That is what is usually understood. It's run by various sectors. We have large commercial players such as Frontiers, Public Library of Science, Elsevier, Wiley, and so on, who offer open access because open access was meant as a substitution for the subscription model, meaning that you needed licenses to access information. And more information is freely available on the internet. But open access is not just that, what publishers do and large commercial publishers do, but it's also what is done by scientific communities themselves. It's happening on repositories, it's happening on websites and whatsoever. But what we usually understand about open access is it's within a clear intellectual property framework, meaning it's legal to do this. It's not some kind of Napster where you can access stuff, but it's freely available on the internet with the consent of the producers, with the consent of the right holders. What we see now is there is the commercial sector, there is the repository sector, but there is also a strong move towards so-called diamond open access, meaning that it's done by institutions, and where in the commercial model, open access is usually funded by authors or their institutions, and they pay for their articles to be published. Diamond open access means that the infrastructure is freely available online. And you will understand a bit more when I dive more deeply into it, because when we started our project, we had to explain a lot. So this is what you will be getting from today. I talk you through our Craft-OA project because it will also highlight much more what we do around open access. And also I will explain what we mean by diamond open access. And then I will expand the concept of research objects that we usually see in the EOSC, which is mainly still focusing on research data. And I will use a specific small case study because I learned a lot from that case study, and hopefully you can also learn a lot from that case study, because then the verifying publications make sense. We also, when we have publications, especially in open access on the internet, we also use the FAIR concept of findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. But it's a bit different than what I usually see in especially the EOSC projects that are coming from certain disciplines and domains, agriculture, fishery, medical science, and so on. And then I will briefly touch upon Fair Action Plan potentials in Germany. I'm not somebody who is behind such a Fair Action Plan, and it was already introduced in one of the earlier sessions, but I will try with my background that I give you to show you some of the potentials. So the Craft-OA project started last year in January. We are 1 year into it. I'm sorry, there's a typo. It ends by the end of 2025. It has a budget of 5 million euro. Has 23 partners. Most of them are active in publishing themselves. So we have the publishing community within our project, and we as Göttingen University Library coordinate this on behalf of the Operas community. I won't talk you through everything, but if you see these bullets, so what we try is creating a robust, accessible, federated technology for open access. Because as I described briefly before, we have the commercial sector. The commercial sector usually has its infrastructure, its standards, its governance models, and also its data flows pretty good under control. Whereas the community-owned and institutionally owned open access is also doing well, but sometimes lagging behind, mostly because there is a lack of funding, but also there's a lack of standardization and interoperability. So what we try to do is to build communities of practice, because at the end of the day, open access, FAIR, and the EOSC, it only will thrive if the communities, human beings like us here in this talk, organize themselves, agree on standards, agree on governance models, and practice altogether. What we also aim is to increase the visibility and discoverability of the non-commercial part of open access. I show you some examples why the commercial sector is pretty successful in visibility and discoverability, and this is where we do need to bring some momentum to the field. And we aim to integrate publishing and publishing outputs, especially the ones from the Diamond open access sector, into the EOSC. And for that, we need to provide technical improvements for journal platforms and journal software. And we had been asked how we align with the 3Rs of the EOSC. And it was, for us, it was a good practice to think, what do we do? And one thing that we definitely support is that we ensure that open access open science practices and skills are rewarded and taught and becoming the new normal. And that means that for scientists, for infrastructures, for researchers, for everybody around, open access publications, no matter where they come from, whether they come from Elsevier or from a small Croatian university press, that they are rewarded and recognized as serious science, and that we get away from the branding of the commercial sector. And we think that publishing done right, open access publishing done right, is anyway working towards the paradigm shift of open science. And open science can move towards the public if it's, that's my personal belief, if it's exercised by public institutions. And that is, for instance, universities, university libraries, university presses, and so on. And then we also realized that one of the most important goals of the EOSC is standardization, interoperability, applying standards, and things like persistent identifiers. And this is exactly what is happening in publishing. So the definition of standards and tools and services, this is exactly where publishing needs to move, and therefore publishing can move into the EOSC as well. And if publishing is done right, it enables FAIR in its full framework. I don't need to talk you through this. You can look at it. It will be part of the YouTube recording. But just to remind you again, publications can only thrive if they have rich metadata, because this is how we find them. This is how we organize them. This is how we've been trained as scientists. We cite things by using metadata. What we also realized in our consortium, and therefore I'm really grateful that it's a large consortium of many European partners, much of publishing, wouldn't say suffers, but is really challenged by multilingualism. If we would only listen to our most established research assessment people, they would say, publish in English, publish in international journals, make sure that your stuff is visible in Scopus and Web of Science, because that then is completely streamlined and multilingualism doesn't provide any problems. And I've seen from your names that many of you come from countries that don't use the most simplified Latin alphabets. Some of you even come from countries with non-Latin alphabets. And if you look into a typical index of scientific results, you will see that your names will be distorted. You are used that your names are broken down into funny English letters. And this is where we, from the publishing sector, need to make sure that the richness that multilingualism brings in cultural and linguistic forms, that this is not lost on the journey into larger, standardized and interoperable data realms such as the EOSC. And one of the prerequisites that this is working is also that there is always a clear license situation in place, because that's one of the prerequisites for reusability. So this is one thing where we as a Craft.OA project think we will definitely contribute towards the EOSC. The third one is that we think we also help in establishing a sustainable and federated infrastructure that enables sharing of scientific results openly and for a long time. And sustainable always means it's there to stay around. And we think that if publishing is done right, it enables these federated infrastructures, because at the end of the day, publishing only works if it's visible, if it's taken up, if it's shared, and that requires these trusted and federated infrastructures. What we don't fully have yet is a culture of sharing, and you are probably familiar with it. I guess that most of you have your own scientific background, and you are probably also familiar with that there's a high competition in place. We come to that later on. And a real sharing, making sure that data and publications are there to share, and not just for others to pick it up and praise you, but that they can work with your stuff. We are not fully there yet, and we need our infrastructures to support such a culture of sharing. And therefore, we definitely need technically mature infrastructures for open access publishing, and not fully rely on the commercial sector, but also build our own open access communities, infrastructures from science itself, from the scientific system. This is just briefly what we will be delivering. So we definitely want more small open access journals to be indexed in the widest range of data aggregations, because we think they need to be more visible, they deserve more visibility and more uptake. And for that, we need clear technical standards, and we're really on the way of doing this. And if you have the chance to listen to one of our Craft.OA or DMS projects, then please join, because I think we have quite exciting stuff coming up. Especially, we're working on standards for publishing itself, so that we don't just look at the results, but also at the processes, how publications actually come into the world. And we will help with practical stuff such as a living handbook for journal platform operations, so that really each small research organization or small research unit or university is either able to join up with a larger journal platform at a larger institution, or run journal platforms yourself. And we'll be coming around with the practical stuff such as summer schools. And this for me was really a challenge, because when I come from publishing, and so the EOSC was always, this is what the colleagues do, the colleagues who do the research data management, and I hope they know what they do. And because we started the Craft.OA project, I had to really get myself around what is the EOSC and why does it make sense for publishing. And I think by now I'm starting to understand why it's important. And one of the things that we absolutely want to see is that as many publishing platforms doing open access, producing fair content, that they are visible in the EOSC, on the EOSC marketplace, that they are able to use the same standards and the same tools that enable their output and their content to be visible and interoperable within the EOSC. And therefore, we need to build up momentum around Diamond Open Access Publishing. So once again, the one that is not dominated by the commercial sector, but that is done by science itself, because this is my personal observation. Research organizations, especially at the highest management level, believe that there is nothing to be done about open access. It's all there. and they don't understand how much money is going into it, how difficult it is for the researchers to, for instance, publish somewhere else than in the usual Elsevier, Wiley, Frontiers and MDPI journals, but to run their own journals, and that we absolutely need this for a culturally and multilingually diverse ecosystem of publishing. Otherwise, we end up in a mainstreamed, all English, all so-called international, all streamlined publishing environment. That's just in a nutshell our consortium. You don't need to read through it, but those of you who are for a long time around, also in the predecessing projects that led towards the EOS, such as OpenAIRE and Driver, you will probably recognize many familiar stakeholders. And this was deliberate. We started this project and said we need a large project consortium because we need as many perspectives and views on publishing and how publishing should result into the EOSC as possible. And therefore, it's a challenge to manage such a large consortium. The Fair Impact people will know this, but it's also fun because we have the community within our project. And as said in the beginning, what we want is making institutional Diamond Open Access a default. It should not be something, you have published in this small little journal that nobody knows, but things should be judged by the output, not by the brand of the channel. And therefore, we need to create a trusted and federated system for scholarly publishing that is sustainable and is governed by SCIENT itself, and also run and strategically driven into the direction that science needs it, to make sure that it contributes to the open science paradigms and to make FAIR the default in open access publishing. And what is for us in Craft.OA also a specific emphasis that we think the humanities and social sciences they are not lagging behind because they are too stupid to do good research, but they are definitely not on the agenda of the commercially and profit-oriented publishing brands, because there is not the big money to be made. And that means that much of the humanities and social sciences output is less visible than it should be in comparison to its meaning for society at large. And there, a large share of humanities and social sciences, sorry for not dissolving the acronym, much of the humanities and social sciences research sits in institutional Diamond Open Access platforms, much more than from other fields. And if we unlock the potential of this part of publishing, then we also unlock the potential of these disciplines. The case study. So I work in a library, and we have a university with 13 faculties. And one of the things that we keep on telling our researchers when they ask, what do we need to know about open access? And then I tell them, the most important thing you need to remember is you can call your library and get information. You don't need to recall all the details. And this has somehow sunk into researchers' head that when they have a really complicated question that has somehow to do with information management or so, they can maybe get help from the university library. So we were approached by medical researchers, and they wanted help in systematic review. And just to recap once again, medical research is often done in the lab. So that's, for instance, in vitro research or animal research, but it's also done with meta studies. So systematic reviews and meta-analysis, where you throw thousands of studies together and you try to pull out knowledge from these systematic reviews. And in order to do this, you need to formulate your own research question. So I was approached by a young researcher, and he has a research project, and he says, what barriers exist in science communication about research that involves animal experiments? Because in Germany, and probably that's also the case in many of your home countries, this is a really highly discussed and controversial issue are we as humans eligible to pull animals into labs, cut open their heads to test things? And so there is a lot of science communication going around about animal experiments, and they wanted to do some research on also understanding what makes such science communication problematic, because much of the controversial discussion sometimes comes from misunderstandings, but also from problematic research. So their approach was, we want to find out. And one of the things that they asked me, and this was something completely new to me, they asked me if I could review their search string. Many of you are probably from information science, so you are familiar with the Boole operators such as AND, OR. And so the researcher showed me his search string and said, are we getting somewhere with it? I thought they had it pretty much in place. The only thing that I was able to tell them is that, look, you have a language bias, because the sources that you're using are heavily influenced by commercial interests and by streamlined research happening in English. And that means that you will also have a bias about a term such as science communication. And this was something that they didn't reflect on, because they are medical researchers. I'm a trained social anthropologist. So this was something that I immediately caught. And I would probably miss out on other things where they had caught my blind spot or whatsoever. So this is something that is quite typical for systematic reviews, that you also revisit your own biases and your own blind spots in order to pull out the best of the data that is possible. So what they try is to reach the highest level of precision and recall, and to make sure that if they apply their search string to a large set of data, in this case publications, that they don't have false positives in there, and that they don't miss out on the most important papers with their search string, but also with their whole strategy. One thing that is really important in systematic reviews is you need to address biases. You need to, for instance, address bias in what kind of research are you looking at? Is your data complete? Are there problems with anonymity and blinding? And so we don't need to drill into detail with this, but this was something that I had to learn. And for me, a whole new field opened up when I interacted with this research question from this researcher, because then I learned something of how do you assess a risk of bias? So this is how they do it. They organize it to also weigh how certain studies come into their systematic review. And you can probably start to imagine that they totally rely on trusted data sources when this is coming into their systematic review. In the case of this medical research, and I typed there, so I'm a layperson to this kind of medical research. I'm a social scientist. I'm pretty good at detecting biases. But here I used their term, and it was the Cochrane Collaborations Tool for Assessing the Risk of Bias. Simply threw it into Google, looked at the pictures that were coming up. What I see here is that this looks, on the first glance, everything looks scientific, everything looks valid and reasonable and useful. And the reason why that is the case is that I used the container ship harbor approach. I did a very precise search for a very precise item in a highly organized field of knowledge. So I was probably saying, give me container 5A that is next to the crane here on the water. And this is the outcome. If you have a very organized data domain, very organized field with a very clear limited search string, the outcome is what I show you here. That is the case for instance, medical research in publications. But that is not the reality for everything. And you can imagine that this is only a very limited way of looking at knowledge, sitting in data and in publications. So let's once again look at how knowledge is made shippable. Fair is the better word, but we use the picture, the image of ships and containers. How is it done? It's collections, just a pile of knowledge sitting somewhere. Collections are very well organized by libraries. And we briefly look into it, how FAIR, with all the 4 letters, is sitting within these ways of organizing knowledge and how open access plays a part in it. Repositories, registries, indexes, but also research graphs. And collections and libraries, and I'll show you briefly why that is the case, are very good in the first 2 letters, findable and accessible. Interoperable and reusable comes later on. The indexing industry is doing a fantastic job. And of course, this is my ego perspective. They show me how I'm doing in my little research. I sometimes write papers. And of course, Scopus is picking up all the papers that they find in their own databases. I have written a lot more, but they are not visible in Scopus, because for Scopus, it doesn't count because it's out of their scope. Scopus is run by Reed Elsevier. That's it's a large industry. It has lovely margins. It has lovely revenues for the stakeholders. And so you can imagine that what Scopus is doing here, yes, they are also doing this for me so that I can say, yeah, wow, I have such a wonderful age index. I mean, it's ridiculous, but it doesn't matter. But Scopus and Reed Elsevier, they are living on the competition among researchers, research institutions, papers, journals. And our culture, our sharing culture that we try to live in the EOS paradigm is not what they want us to do. But they will definitely also find their small share in if we, as the communities that want to introduce open science and open access, they'll find their place. But maybe their margins will drop down a little bit. Another one is Web of Science. They are also really good in telling us, the scientific communities, what we should measure in order to compare us with others and how great we are doing. And they will sell us all the tools that we want. And also, this is a large industry. You just do a small search in Google, you type Clarivate and profit, and you get their stock exchange rates. That's the reality. Now, libraries have a long-standing history, and the reason that, for instance, in my library, the period that if I do a search in our catalog starts at 1400 is because our oldest publications are from that date. And this is what a library will do. It will organize everything that it has in a way that is hopefully useful for the users. And libraries have a long-standing history of trying to be as agnostic and as neutral as possible in order to bring the best benefits to their users. And what we see here is a perfect example of everything here is findable and accessible. Whether it's interoperable relies on the typical work of librarians. And librarians have done this already in the age of where everything was in print, that they started with metadata, classifications, larger classifications, to make sure that if you look for one item, you also find similar other items. And I was socialized still with these catalogs where you go through these little boxes, and where for every publication there was something typed on that would enable me to find something similar. And this was the early days of interoperability. Nowadays we are much better with this, but so this, the findable, accessible, this is absolute library standard. Interoperability comes with metadata and also with discovery systems. The reusability, at least here we have it on the most simple level, is that, for instance, we have here electronic sources. And guess what? Most of what is electronically here is also open access, because this is very easy for libraries to pick it up. You're probably all familiar with repositories. And while this looks like a pretty old school way of organizing knowledge, what is underneath the surface of something like high energy physics theory, new recent search, is extremely well organized knowledge. And it's not only findable and accessible, it's fully interoperable. And because it sits on arXiv, it's all reusable, because that's from design on. I don't know whether I can make this work. I haven't tried it out because we didn't do any rehearsal. I won't go into it, but this is the Open Research Knowledge Graph done from my colleagues at the Technical Information Library in Hanover. And maybe I can do that later on once I left my presentation, because there we see a very beautiful way of organizing knowledge in a graph, and that opens new dimensions of knowledge, accessibility, and interaction. And here's one citation from the OpenAIRE graph, and I guess many of you are familiar with it because it's also part of the European Open Science Cloud. So the OpenAIRE graph is a free and open resource that brings together and interlinks hundreds of millions of metadata records from over 70,000 data sources trusted by researchers. And that is the most important thing. Because what when we look at the EOSC, the graphs, what libraries can discover, it's one thing is how it's presented to us so that we can interact with it. We can do some searches, we can do browsing, but the most important thing is the sources underneath it. And this is why I showed you this small case study, because if you want to make statements how science communication is blocked by certain ways of talking about animal experiments, for instance, showing these drastic pictures of primates sitting in laboratories, you can only base your scientific statements if you can trust the sources. And this is where open access then suddenly fully starts to unfold. Because if open access is done right, it opens us an enormous field of trusted sources that we can use and that we can make interoperable by throwing them together and using all kinds of technologies, repository technologies, discovery technologies, graph technology, in order to get more meta meaning out of these sources. What we have in Germany, and I think this is this is a really beautiful baseline on where more fair, whether it's to open access publications, to open science, to open research data, can grow on, is our so-called nationale Forschungsdateninfrastruktur. It's our national research data infrastructure. And I read this out to you, and you can tell me whether it somehow sounds familiar. It's a nationwide distributed competence and infrastructure network intended to support the provision, development, availability, and reproducibility of research data and science. For me, this sounds pretty much like EOSC, and it's also meant to sound like this. Because if you look at it, for instance, what is done in our NFDI, National Research Data Infrastructure, is, for instance, that it's looking at fair digital objects, no matter whether it's research data or publications. It's looking at long-term archiving, search and harvesting, metadata schemata, persistent identifiers, and this is all, and license and copyright, this is all something that we are so familiar in publishing, because those are the absolute prerequisites for publishing done right, that you have these things in place. And for the infrastructures, it doesn't really matter whether the digital object at the end of a metadata field with clear licensing is a data set or a publication. Because often data sets are publications, and publications are often data sets, especially in humanities and humanities and social sciences, where publications and research data often start to blur. And what we also have in the National Research Data Infrastructure, and this might also be familiar for those of you for a long time in the EOSC, is it's organized around domains and disciplines. To make sure, because it's easier to start interoperability among physics and chemistry than among physics and philosophy, for instance. So the interoperability approaches, and you all know that it's a lot of work to get these things going and to organize that they are really interoperable. It starts from where it works already, and then from there it starts to expand and grow. And so I think, so far in Germany, our NFDI is focusing mainly on research data because this is where they start, but they expand more and more to publications, because at the end of the day, processing metadata in clear licensing schemes is also open to publications, and publications should become a natural part of this. And in my view, especially the smaller Diamond Open Access platforms that are not out there to bring lots of revenues to their stakeholders, they are quite open to this, to say, if you have a data set with your publication, we're happy to include a new metadata field for you so that you can put the link of your research data repository in there. And so this is one of the platforms where I think in Germany we can really make a difference by bringing the field of publishing and the field of research data closer together and using the infrastructures that are there. And the EOSC will be absolutely helping in bringing one of the larger umbrellas. The other one is that I think that fair open access in Germany is definitely on the rise. Our German Research Foundation has just 3 weeks ago launched a 9 million euro call to strengthen Diamond Open Access and to build up Diamond Open Access service place, help desk infrastructures. And so in Germany, lots of stakeholders are, how we are going to contribute to this. But what is absolutely for sure, yes, 9 million euro will be project money funded towards a consortium that will do the work, but we will have many smaller university presses, smaller journals that will benefit from such an action of the German Research Foundation. And we have a National Ministry for Research and Education that has a quite clear open access policy. And one of the things that they have been funding for a long time is our it's our German speaking, but it's not only in German, it's also in English. It's the so-called Open Access Network, and feel free to browse around and have a look there, because here it's the focus is on the community. Yes, we could focus on the data and things like this, which is also happening, but our within the German Open Access community, and I share this with many of my European colleagues, is the most important thing is to strengthen communities, because at the end of the day, open access and open science relies on communities of practice. It's not happening because the commercial sector is trying to sell it to us. It's happening because we do it. And we do it if we are trained well, if we are informed well, if we are networked well, and if we have good services at place. And this is where Craft-OR tries to help. This is where you probably all try to help with your projects in Fair Impact. And this is where we all count on the EOSC that it will support us with the general infrastructure to make these visions come true. And with that, I'm done. And I hope I didn't bust my time. No, I'm a bit early, but that leaves you more time for questions.
Thank you very much, Margot, for this really clear and great presentation. So as I mentioned earlier, like if you have some questions, really don't hesitate to put them on the chat, and I will add them to Margot. So we have questions about how to recognize open science skills and practices in the case of Diamond open access journals. So maybe Margot, you can say a few words about it.
Mm-hmm. So one of the key exploitable results in the Craft-OR project is that we want to we will be building a plugin for Open Journal System. Briefly, in a nutshell, Open Journal System is the most prevalent open source software for smaller open access journals. And that means if there is something in place to bring more visibility, for instance, to open science practices for OJS, Open Journal System, then the chance is high that many of these smaller journals will use such a plugin. And in that plugin, a small journal can do with little effort, can showcase all the open science practices that they have in place. Because the plugin will, for instance, so imagine you're a journal manager and you run your journal on Croatian language within the larger Mediterranean area. And you are not familiar with FAIR and you're not familiar with open science, but you are pretty good in your topic. So then the plugin will help you to walk through certain fields and to know, I can fill in that I allow inclusion of persistent identifiers to data repositories. And so this is on a very practical level to enable the smaller journal managers to realize that maybe they are already supporting many more open science practices than they are aware of. Because if you are active in Diamond Open Access Publishing, you will most likely come with a set of values and approaches and paradigms that support open science, because open science hasn't dropped from the sky. It was growing within us because we thought this is the better way of doing open science. So what we realized that in publishing, there's often an implicit practice of open science that people are not aware of. So if there are tools that help them to realize, hey, we are actually supporting much more open science than we thought, that would, for instance, help. Does that answer the question of the person? Sorry, it was a bit long, but we have lots of time, so I took the time to give a long answer.
Yeah, thank you very much. Yeah, I think it's quite clear. Thank you very much. We have another question also. Do you think that institutional Diamond access publishing will not compromise the quality of what is published compared to other journals?
That is a really good question, and I will take a bit to, I will circle around your question. So Hindawi was one of the open access publishers of the most early days. It was founded in Egypt, and Hindawi was mostly supporting mathematical journals. And within their field, they had a pretty good reputation. And then open access started to rise, especially open access where you pay the publisher to get your article published. If you are a serious open access publisher, you don't just accept more articles in order to to gain more money, because then you would be like somebody who sells fake sunglasses on the beach. You sell it once, people realize it's crap and they don't buy again. The same goes for open access publishing. So if you mess up your own brand by lowering the threshold of your quality standards, you won't survive in science, because if your reputation is done, it's done. And so Hindawi had a pretty good reputation. Then Hindawi was acquired by Wiley, and Wiley thought, now we can expand this and we make much more money, and now we can cover all these fields and whole Africa and mathematics. And they started to grow Hindawi without the care on the quality of the brand that Hindawi had before. And then basically the brand exploded. Lots of citation cartels, special issues with questionable review procedures in place. And Wiley suddenly had a huge problem. And Wiley is, if you ask your researchers around the corner, they will probably all say, yeah, Wiley, that's a really good publisher. Now Wiley has to bury the brand Hindawi because they didn't take enough care to keep the quality measures into place. So this happened to a large commercial publisher. MDPI and Frontiers are running into similar problems, and they are all commercial. So the question is, if the commercial sector, with all this money that they have and all the revenues that they have, if they can't keep their quality control measures in place, what does that say about institutional diamond open access? And my personal opinion is it says nothing about it, because there is something intrinsic in publishing, and that is you don't get your brand sustainable, you don't get your publication channel, your journal, your book series or whatsoever in place if you mess around with quality. It maybe pays for a short run, but it doesn't pay in the long run. But then again, we also need to, and I would like to remind you of the example of arXiv. arXiv is not a publisher. arXiv is something where the self-responsibility of certain scientific communities lives. And they have some basic quality measures in place. And if you pick up a paper at arXiv, you wouldn't necessarily say it's great, but you would also not necessarily say it's messy, it's bad, because it doesn't have quality control. What you would probably do is look at the paper itself and then judge its quality. And when it comes to diamond open access publishing, there are some publishing outlets in place that have a very strict quality control in place, strong review process, and others less strict. But what I think what the diamond open access publishing, and especially the institutional open access publishing, is doing is being very clear about the scope and very clear to state what is here. Because one of the problems that Hindawi had is trying to sell to researchers, there was peer review in place, where in fact it wasn't. So what we lacked there was transparency. And what I see in the institutional open access sector, that there is a strong value on transparency and saying, what is the scope of my publishing outlet? Is it peer reviewed? What do we take in? What don't we take in? And how do we assess the quality? Whereas the revenue-driven or even the fraudulent sector will exactly not tell you what they do, because they will try to sell you something. So you pay them money for something that they might not deliver. And this is the difference in the diamond open access publishing, because yes, we will be having outlets that don't exercise any quality control, because for instance, in the case of arXiv, they will trust on the integrity of the scientific community itself. But what you will usually find is that these diamond open access institutional outlets are very clear on what they cover, how they assess quality, and how they review.
Thank you, and it was like a really good and complete answer, and like with a lot of metaphor. It was really nice. Thank you very much. We have another question also about how to encourage researchers to use control vocabularies when they are selecting words. And we have an example like for AgroVoc or GMAT instead of 3 words. So that could improve the research.
I think that is it's a really good question, and I don't really have an answer to this. So I'm also in charge for our dissertation thesis server, because most of the dissertations from Göttingen University are open access publications sitting on our server. And if you look at how much care people put into keywords and controlled vocabulary, the range is enormous. Some people do this because they believe in it, and some people don't. And I have not really found an answer how to encourage them. I hope that with artificial intelligence and with suggesting keywords, for instance, by running large language models on their abstracts or also on their metadata, might help. And otherwise, probably we need to start this already in basic studies in bachelor degrees to tell people interoperability and trusted research comes with metadata. Metadata is controlled vocabulary. Make use of it. It doesn't drop from the sky. It needs people to do it. And to train, for instance, young students already to use keywords for their own assignments. It's nothing, but if you are trained right from the start, then maybe it helps. And my daughter is about to do her finish her school, and she's doing some first small baby steps in scientific work. And I'm pressing this into her head because Mama works in the library, says metadata, 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 vocabulary, cite correctly. And I realize it's a lot of work, but it needs to start very early because we need to be trained as researchers to value this as part of our scientific work.
We have also another question about the diamond models and how it improves the impact of journal in order to encourage researchers to publish in those journals, and all the metrics to evaluate the journal should be reviewed.
What I would like to do is, so if you ask a normal researcher, especially the older ones, if you ask them what are the most important indexes for science, they will most likely say Scopus and Web of Science. And they will assess and judge many things with these indexes. And the reality is that for many, I don't know whether it's many, but this is anecdotal evidence that I can give to you. When we have conversations at Göttingen University, people will say, if it's not in Scopus, it's not real science, which is absolute bullshit. But this is the way, this is the easiest. It's a one-stop shop, and if I can't find it there, then it doesn't exist because it's meaningless and I don't need to value it. However, we also have other indexes, and one of the index and I think these research graphs that we have, they should be brought to the attention. This is not some crazy information scientist doing their little follies. This is a way of organizing and making knowledge accessible in a neutral and hopefully non-biased way, because the most conventional indexes are extremely biased, and Scopus and Web of Science are so biased that some institutions are really pulling out. I think it was Sorbonne University. They have They have stopped licensing Web of Science because they said they don't want their researchers to be completely streamlined according to these indexes. So what we aim for is, for instance, that Diamond Open Access should be visible in larger data aggregations, such as these research graphs in the EOSC. And frankly, for an open access journal, the directory of open access journals, DOAJ, that is the absolute baseline. And this is where these journals should be visible. And if they can't do it yet, then hopefully in 1 year's time, we have our so-called Diamond Discovery Hub in place, where these journals can show what they do. They can also show how they support open science. They are chosen for their governance model. And again, this is a long work to wean researchers and also research managers off from Scopus and Web of Science, because that is just a small part of the reality. There are so many more journals that are not visible in these indexes. And actually, I have one picture here. So if you take this as the whole cloud of scientific publications, then Web of Science and Scopus will maybe only show you this small section. But they have been really good in training us all to say, if it's outside of our scope, then it doesn't count, and then you can also ignore it. But that's just not true. And therefore, I think one of the prerequisites technically is to make sure that your metadata is findable, accessible, interoperable, the metadata, really, really important. And that your platforms are able to deliver metadata in a way that, for instance, Bayes or the EOSC or the OpenAIRE Research Graph, Google Scholar, all kinds of indexes that are also there and meaningful, that they can pick up your metadata. I hope, did that somehow answer the question?
It seems yes. Thank you very much.
Besser shortly, but I'm aware that this is a lot of hard work. And to be honest, we have in our university press, we have 2 journals, and we are not struggling, but we simply don't have the time to really go through the indexing to make sure that it's visible in EBSCO and in subject-specific indices, because we are so busy and occupied with getting the content in, curating the content, reviewing the content, displaying the content, that we don't have enough capacity to make sure that the indexing is also done. And this is why the commercial sector seems to be so much more powerful and so much more successful than the Diamond Open Access sector, because they have specialists. They have something like a whole team only working on indexes.
Maureen, do you want to say a few words? You can turn your mic on.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you so much, Margot, for this nice presentation. Yeah, my name is Maureen. I am a data steward, and then I'm also coordinating a repository. So here in Germany, so we are based in Münchenberg. So I want to ask you, so you work in the library. My question is, in this same university, do you have a data infrastructure like a repository? Where I would say researchers publish I would say data from their research directly that is not linked to maybe some texts or journals, articles. Do you have something like that?
We have something, so we have a university with 13 faculties. That includes mathematics, medical science, and so on. And we also run a Dataverse, so a data repository. But we also realized that, for instance, our computer scientists or our medical scientists, they had their own research data infrastructure in place. long before it became was rising on the agenda of researchers. So our Dataverse is currently mainly helping those researchers that are more new to the field of research data management. And for them, we have support infrastructures in place, but the most important thing that we have, and if you say you're a data steward, that's a wonderful job title. We have people who help people to understand why it's important to do research data management. And my personal observation is maybe that's even more important than the technical infrastructure. Because if you visit Re3 Data, you find so many data repositories. So the technical availability is not so much of the problem. The most important challenge is, how do I start it? How do I do it? How do I work with data that should protect individual people or personal, delicate, sensitive data?
Sensitive data, yeah.
Exactly. So those are the challenges. And at Göttingen University, we started from how can we help the people, then what kind of technical infrastructure could they maybe need? So, and I think it should be coming from two ways. One is understanding the use case, understanding the challenges for researchers, and on the other hand, starting with technical infrastructure. And I think it's definitely not perfect at Göttingen University, but we are pretty good in having technical infrastructures in place, but also that people are there. The data steward model is not just some fancy job title. It's extremely important because it always starts with individual researchers and their question, and then these two things need to meet.
Yeah. Yeah, just like you mentioned about this early career, introducing them into the importance of research data management, because we are really facing challenges to deal with, the senior researchers. They don't really find it so important. Some of them also don't have the time. And we know that mostly these PhDs or master students, they are mostly the one collecting data, processing the data to a larger extent. So I think we are, I don't know, should I say, advocating for the fact that these aspects of research data management should be introduced, I don't know, maybe in the curricula at a very early age, so that they grow up, with this knowledge of knowing that sharing is important, but also sharing what is of high quality. Yeah. So because I asked this question about the library and the repository, because, for example, where I am based, some researchers at times don't know when they have to consult the library or when they have to consult the research data management team. And yeah, so that's why I wanted to ask how maybe you manage it from your end. So, okay, but it's clear somehow.
Yeah, but Maureen, if I can come back to one, because you raised a really, really important issue, and that is we have the PhDs, we have the people who gather the data, and then we have the senior researchers. And this is something where I think we, as the open science advocates, also the infrastructures, really need to make a point that, are we talking to the right people? Because if we are preaching to the choir, we persuade the PhD students who anyway, they know controlled vocabulary, great metadata, and they have great documentation in their Jupyter notebooks. They are the ones that we have persuaded already, and they are the ones that are living open science practices. And how do we reach the ones who lack the time, who are not in the details? And I think that's one of the challenges. And I don't have a solution to this yet, but I think it's really made a really good point, because we need to keep these people in our focus that are not there yet and will maybe never practice open science because they are not practicing science anymore on the bench or in the field, because they have turned more into science managers. And so I think this is quite important that we keep in mind that if we really want to make change, we can't just talk to the PhD students who do it anyway right, but we need to make sure that we also reach the ones who organize science on a high level, not just as managers, but as PIs or whatever. And then the other one, how do you communicate and make sure that people understand where they need to turn to? I hope I don't disencourage you, but I am doing since 20 years now the Don Quixote. I'm running against the windmill and talking to people over and over again. Talk to the library. Yes, we have it all in place and it's never ending. And what helped me is that to make sure that people approach the right people and do the right, take the right roadmap towards practicing open science is more like gardening. If you let your garden just go, you have all kinds of weeds and wild herbs and it looks like a mess. So you need constant gardening. And the same is to communicate who are the right people, the right data students, the stewards, the right infrastructures, the right capacity centers. It's like gardening. We need to do it over and over and over and over again and find our joy in such small case studies. And this is why I presented to you, and I'm grateful that you all listened to it, this small case study, because for me, that small case study where somebody came and said, can you please look at my systematic review search string? To me, this was extremely rewarding because I suddenly understood much more of my work. And I thought, how great that that person approached me. And he took a long term. It took him a week to find me, asking the wrong people. And it was really rewarding to see, yes, if we have patience and if we believe in what we do, we get the reward because things and people find their ways together. But it's an ongoing work.
We have also another question about Amira. As you explained in your presentation, the main indexes are rather commercial. So how do you manage, organize the open access knowledge to enhance visibility and transparency, fairness, and related aspects of the research assessment?
As I said, the directory of open access journals is, I think, one of the baselines. And the beauty of this directory of open access journals is it's community owned, community governed, and it has kept its neutral approach. So it has commercial open access in there, it has genuine open access in there, it has diamond open access in there, because it basically runs every journal, every publishing platform through a certain set of questions and quality checks and indexes them there. And I think that the OpenAIRE research graph and other research graphs are still underestimated in their meaningness because they are agnostic in a way towards the business model. And we can't blame the commercial and profit-oriented sector for being commercial and profit-oriented. That's their basic nature. And they can't be blamed for that. And they can't be blamed for trying to twitch the system in their favor, because they are commercial and they have been allowed to grow in this form. And so they will try to do everything to influence our sector. And we need to learn to understand, for instance, that they are only covering a small part of it. And it's, as said to Maureen, it's a constant endeavor to tell people over and over again. And you probably have all had these discussions with the researchers when they talk about the impact factor, and you tell them, hey, come on, the impact factor is even mathematically flawed, and it's neither technically nor scientifically sound. And they will all say, yeah. And then in the next faculty meeting, they will again use the impact factor to assess the quality of a research application. So this is ongoing. And I think one of the things that we can do is make sure that other data collections are as good as we want them to be, to make sure that as much of controlled and trusted data sources flows in there. And I think Google Scholar, for instance, is, yes, Google is commercial as well, but they don't try to influence the scientific system at large into their favor, because for them, we're just a small sector. So just by the economy of scale, it's sort of neutral. And I think a bit of lobbying to say, hey, come on, there's a bias in these highly commercial indexes, that also helps, but it takes a long time.
Okay, so we don't have other questions from the audience, but I have a short one, and like if you have ideas, really like do not hesitate to add them in the chat, and I will ask them after. I have a question about like if you have some ideas on how we can find where we can find like training and not training, but tools to train searcher and publication upon access in the model diamond in our country. Do you have like special tips for us?
The projects DIAMAS and Craft.OA have both been funded in order to deliver in this field, because the reason that you don't know this immediately by yourself doesn't necessarily mean there is nothing, but it means it's definitely not findable enough. And this is why these two projects have been funded, in order to make this, to bring this to the awareness, to organize also tips on trainings and stuff like this, because those are really important building blocks of coming to open science, that it's easy for people to find information. And the last picture of my presentation was that I showed you the information and communication platform on open access in the German-speaking field. This was also funded because it became obvious that people have a really hard time to find the right information. And Maureen made the same point around research data management, that people seem to be giving up too early because they don't find what they look for, and then they think, yeah, maybe it's not so important. And so this, I think, is one of our jobs as these projects, to make sure that there are not one-stop shops, but one point of entries into knowledge around these fields. And so I recommend to keep your eyes open for Craft.OA and the DIAMAS project, and also feel free to look around on the German platform, because I think it's well, we help with the project, but we think it's pretty good, and it's really accepted in the German open access community, because people contribute to it and they also give feedback, and there's a lively network of people behind it. And frankly, I would really like that in all larger European languages, we have platforms like this, that you can also communicate easy to researchers and say, if you want to know something about open access, then have a look there. That's always a good starting point. But your observation is totally valid. We lack these collections up to now, but it's coming.
Do we have other questions from the audience? Do you have or experience that you want to share with us about your national policy about open science, maybe? Yes, Shukri?
Yes, thank you, Nina, for the great question and for the great workshop. I also would like to thank Margot for the great effort. About the open access models and which should the community of researchers should adopt. I personally think that as a professional or as technical person who working on scientific data, I have personally the conviction that the issue is more or less the research issue. So it's good to create an alternative model for the researcher in order to avoid those commercial model adopted by some publisher. But mainly, if those researchers didn't seek for those or didn't adopt those model or didn't brand this model, I personally will not succeed. So our role will mainly concentrated in those aspects. It's how to engage this community of researchers in order to adopt those models and to avoid the adoption of some commercial that may commercial model that will not make our scientific data findable and accessible and readable. So the engagement and the outreach work is great there. So mainly we have to act on those on the related action about how to engage in research and community of research on this model. I know that there is an alternative to act on policy, but in my humble opinion, it will not very useful if if the researcher didn't have the conviction to move through this new model and this new diamond model is a good one as you have presented. Thank you very much.
Shukri, you raised a few really important points, and I would like to start with the policies. And please take my apologies that I always start with an example of Göttingen University, but we are such a normal university that maybe we are a good role model. Our university likes when the researchers apply for European funding. So we have a pretty good infrastructure in place to support researchers when they apply for European projects. And then they realize, the European Commission has all these kinds of requirements around open access, and they want us to do this and that. And so just because the university wanted that people apply for this funding and they go for these projects, they realized, we have to adopt these policies. And then you could either do the policy just as a lip service, you do a bit of that and that. But once the process, for instance, started to implement a data policy and open access policies at Göttingen University, all kinds of people had to contribute it and all kinds of people had to interact with it. And then suddenly this policy that was on a monetary level introduced so that people can apply to this funding, it also made a difference. So I wouldn't underestimate policies, because if policies are worked out and implemented, they somehow leave a trace of why they have been set out in the first place. That's one thing. The other thing is, as I said, it takes a lot of time and it takes a lot of interaction. And sometimes I'm about to give up and think, ah, God, I just don't care how people do it. Then go ahead with your Scopus addiction. I don't care anymore. But what we also see is that the commercial sector has run itself into such severe problems. And that's why I used the example of Hindawi and Wiley, that it becomes by now apparent to people that that they can't blame any sector of publishing for being the troublemaker. It's happening everywhere, and it has something to do with integrity. And science without integrity is not science. Then it's something else. It's playing around with stuff, but it's science in itself has to be based on the integrity and reliability. And so what I find quite helpful is to always address these basic values again. Because if we look at, for instance, if we look at open science or FAIR, at the end of the day, this is research integrity. Open science is science done right. And this is where we can find our way into things, also into curricula. And what I found quite helpful is because of science scandals and science fraudulent practices, most research institutions and most universities have courses on research integrity. And this is always the best place also to introduce open science, open access, and the responsibility of researchers to take care of their own publications, because it's not just done by you. You send it to a journal and that's it, but to make reasonable and responsible publishing decisions. For instance, where do I send my research? Is it just a name like Wiley, or is it something that stands for good research itself? And it takes a long time, and we still have a long way to go. And this is why I really value and I'm really happy about all these projects. Fair Impact, Fair to Fair, and you know many of them, because we are doing the right work, but it's sometimes a bit tiring because we don't know whether we reach the right people.
We have another question also from Maureen about apart from the recognition, what other rewards can a researcher have by practicing FAIR?
That's a good question. I mean, if you publish as a researcher, what do you want? You want your stuff to be found, and you want your stuff to be read, and you want your stuff to be understood in the right context, and you want that people use your stuff. So findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Interoperability, for instance, makes sure that research output is seen in its right context. And it only becomes contextualized if it's interoperable. Otherwise, everything sits in a silo. And so one way of doing this is of saying, hey, come on, this is not some good thinking, now we all do this because we want to be good people, but to create narratives that this should be in the very interest of researchers to make their stuff fair. Because if they want to be rewarded for their own results, it's in their own interest to make their stuff findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable. Because then it starts to unfold.
Yeah, Maureen, you
Yeah.
can.
Yeah. I actually asked this question because researchers, they are mostly focusing on publishing articles in research journals, just like you mentioned, and some will want to go in, okay, for I don't know, in journals where they have high index factor and things like that. Because at the end of the day, they notice that if they want to apply for funding or they want to be known as a highly cited a researcher, it is mostly those publications that count. And so now, apart from, I would say, an original article or a review article, other aspects that form data that can come from a researcher, how can they also benefit from that? For example, if they have to be evaluated at the level of their institutions, or if they want to apply for funding. So that is the direction of my question.
I think this is one of the most bizarre paradoxical situation that science has moved itself into, because we all rely on unbiased, available results from others. And then, especially if we are young in the career, or if we are in a problematic funding situation, for instance, a whole institute can be in a problematic funding situation. And then we are at the same time forced to do completely biased publishing, for instance. And this paradox is extremely difficult to tackle. And I know, and I keep on bringing this up in my own university, and I know it's as if I would say, something sits in the corner and rots and stinks. And people go, yeah. Nobody wants to clean up the corner. But we need to do it over and over again. And what I think we also need to do is train young researchers that they understand the mechanics of research assessment, because many of them are not aware of this at all. I do regular trainings on research integrity for forestry students, forestry PhD students. And when I introduced to them for the first time that journals and journal publishers are in an extremely tough competition situation, and that they need to somehow gain the visibility and appear attractive to researchers, they were just not aware of it. They had not thought this through, that the whole sector of publishing, and the one where unfortunately still some research assessment is done by, that this is a highly competitive sector, and that this sector is therefore working in its own interest. And we can't solve the paradoxical situation that you, as a researcher, you should be practicing open science in order to create good science. But then at the same time, you're forced into this tenure and promotion problems. You need to publish in high impact journals. And so the only thing that we definitely can and should do, I think, is train people that they understand the mechanics of publishing, because sometimes they will need to make decisions where they say, I know it's a problematic journal in a commercial sense, or maybe not in a scientific sense. I know that I could be publishing in a sweet diamond open access journal of my colleagues, but I am in a tenure and promotion situation where I do need to go for the high impact, so that people make informed decisions. Because what I don't want to see is that if people have a choice, they can go for the diamond open access journal and strengthening an upcoming journal, or they can go into the established journal and strengthen something that is already way too strong, that they know what they do when they do it. Because sometimes there is no way out. Sometimes people are in this forced situation of doing something that they don't want to do because of tenure and promotion and funding. But when they have a choice, they should be able to live that choice. And that means that they need to understand, where do I have leeway? Where do I have room to move? And where don't I? Because what many of the more established senior researchers is telling their people, yeah, you have to do high impact. But they don't teach them the mechanics of publishing and how this market and this industry is working. And if people understand it, then they can make informed decisions. And they will still need to make decisions that they don't like. But I would like to limit these unfortunate decisions to a number as low as possible. and not that people make publishing decisions because they just don't know any better. But again, I'm always coming back to the same thing. It's a lot of work.
Okay, thank you very much for all this question. It was really interesting session, and I think we are going to the end of this 2-hour session. So thank you very much for this very participative workshop. And also thank you, Margot, for this really nice presentation. And so for the next session will be the 4th of April, and will be about the French data management cluster. So that's it. So again, thank you for everybody, and thank you for all the organization team, Trust IT and the Fairpack team who organize the workshop, and thank you for everybody for this active and valuable participation. Thank you very much.
Oh, and Maureen wrote something into the chat that she would like to keep in touch. Please feel free to sign up for our Craft.OA newsletter, because that might be helpful, and there you will be, you find information on when we run sessions like this, because this is one of our project goals, that we really like to interact with communities and bring more knowledge, more understanding, and also enable communities that they can also formulate clearer for themselves what they need and what they want and where they want to grow into.
Okay, so thank you everybody, and have a nice day, and thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you for the organization team.
Thank you. Bye.